Hello, everyone. Welcome to Humanist Canada webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director with Humanist Canada. And as always, I'll be moderating today's conversation. This webinar will be 60 minutes in length, and I invite you to submit your questions and comments with the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen throughout our conversation. If you would like to ask a question directly, you can also do so anytime throughout our conversation with Anthony. Please raise your hand again at the bottom of the screen, and I will ask you to unmute yourself. And before introducing our guest speaker, I'd like to remind our listeners that Humanist Canada has recently launched a chaplaincy program. You can find more information about it on our website under programs. Also, we're building an archive of video recordings about humanist chaplaincy, and you can also find these under webinars on our website as well. Today, we'll be talking about revitalizing ethics of care, building sustainable humanist communities in higher education. And I'm pleased to welcome Anthony Cruz Pantojas, Humanist Chaplain at Tufts University. Anthony spearheads an initiative for first-generation emerging spiritual, ethical, and cultural leaders in college. They hold master's degrees in theological studies and leadership studies from Andover Newton Theological School and Meadville Lombard Theological School, respectively. Anthony also holds a certificate in humanist studies from the American Humanist Association Center for Education, and is pursuing a doctoral degree in cultural studies. They also serve as a board member of the Association of Chaplaincy and Spiritual Life in Higher Education, and is endorsed by the Humanist Society as a humanist chaplain and celebrant. Welcome, Anthony. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and just for the invitation to be in this virtual space together.
Awesome, likewise. So please tell us a bit about your background, what inspired you to become a humanist chaplain, and what was it?
Yeah, I mean, I always love that question. And I think that every time that I'm interviewed or write something, it's somewhat similar, somewhat distinct. And I would say that, of course, at the time, the notion of humanist chaplain or humanist chaplaincy was not even in my mind at all. But it all began, of course, being raised in Puerto Rico between the Apostolic Prophetic Movement and the Roman Catholic Church. So these were the two religious traditions that I was basically raised in, and this is all pre-college. Once I started college, I actually left Christianity and found myself in the Reformed Jewish community in Puerto Rico, Temple Beth Shalom. And it was actually through this community that actually belongs to the Union for Reformed Judaism that I began a healing process. I began to really connect with my own queerness, to be curious about culture, religion, spirituality. And of course, it was through the whole process of becoming a Jew by choice that I actually began to be exposed to humanism. And, you know, I started then to connect with the Society for Humanistic Judaism in North America, as well as the branch in Israel and other spaces that then I began to see first one framework of chaplaincy through my alma mater, Universidad Interamericana de Puerto Rico, that being a Christian Presbyterian institution, and seeing that model. And then through the Society for Humanistic Judaism, seeing a whole list of humanistic rabbis that were actually in higher ed. For example, Rabbi Greg Epstein and others, right, that kind of modeled that more humanistic framework. And so it was really bridging my love for Judaism, for community, religion, and spirituality, that after completing my undergrad degree in anthropology, launched me to go to graduate school, as you just beautifully stated, and begin that journey.
Thank you. And what is it like being a humanist chaplain at the university?
Sure. I would say that there's not one day that's the same. And I would say that at least here at Tufts University, we move between campuses, right? So we have a main campus in the Medford Somerville area, but we also have a School of the Museum and Fine Arts in downtown Boston, and we have other campuses across Massachusetts. And so we're always on the move. Um, of course, like any other staff or chaplaincy, there's weekly team meetings, there's pastoral meetings and facilitating other meetings and retreats, especially with the humanist community at Tufts, which is the student community that I mentor and supervise, yet they are independent from the humanist chaplaincy. However, I think together, right, we get to the nitty gritty of working, collaborating, and creating spaces here at the university, as well as providing spaces to do rituals, to engage in readings, and also, again, continuing to uplift, on my end, humanist chaplaincy in higher ed context, and providing spaces for students, staff, and faculty on campus.
Okay, and how did you decide that you wanted to be specifically at university as opposed to, doing other types of chaplaincy at another institution?
Yeah, I think that, as I like to joke around and say, that it was a little bit of degrees, a little bit of timing, and a little bit of magic, basically. I had moved to Boston to actually pursue my hospital residency. So to actually become board certified or do the work to potentially become board certified. So I was going to do a residency at a hospital. And then during that summer, right, that gap, actually the position at Tufts opened up. And so after getting pushed and prompted by colleagues and mentors and friends, I decided to apply to the position, and actually, well, ended up being appointed in the fall of 2021 as the Humanist Chaplain at Tufts.
Awesome.
Yes, and I would say I always, again, I kind of knew that I was drawn to higher ed chaplaincy, right? Again, in my undergrad years, I saw it as a model. So I didn't participate in the chaplaincy. I did see that it existed, right? And again, seeing other humanist chaplains being able to be in these spaces, right, of holding the academic, the spiritual, the ethical, and the cultural together in what's defined as chaplaincy. I always dreamt about that possibility. However, as some of us might know, higher ed chaplaincy for the humanist and free thought traditions is not as linear or as defined as other traditions. And so for me, it was more of a dream than an actual possibility.
Come true. So do tell us about your chaplaincy work at Tufts. What exactly do you do on campus?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. So first of all, like I mentioned, right, the humanist chaplaincy, as well as any other chaplaincy here on campus, actually works advancing philosophical, religious, and ethical life on campus, right? We're a confidential resource for students, staff, and faculty. It is a free resource that they are all welcome to come and tap into, either by emailing us and making an appointment or just coming into our offices right during office hours and just coming in, having a space where they can actually be themselves, right? Be vulnerable, decide to empower their own stories, their own narratives, and say, as I'm working, as I'm studying, as I'm living here in this ecosystem, right, I want someone that can actually accompany me, listen to me without judgment, without being bound, right, by our own specific traditions, right? If we were working in a congregation or any other setting, right? So in a way, we are free actually to really accompany people on campus. And I would say that at least some of the work that I do in my humanist chaplaincy specifically is really working to develop a notion of home place for students. So where they are able to really discover, explore, and interrogate their own lives in very exciting and capacious ways while they're journeying here at the university in whichever degree, certificate, or program they're in. Recognizing that humanist chaplaincies in higher education are far and few, right? And so I'm always working, I'm always in the grill, right? Kind of producing and really aspiring specifically to co-create a future of radical interdependence, liberation, and meaning with accountability here at Tufts.
Sounds very interesting. So I would like to once again invite our listeners on the call to, if you have any questions or comments, you don't have to wait until the end. This is not a presentation. This is an informal exchange of ideas. Please feel free to raise your hand, ask your question directly, or put it in the chat. Marty.
I can't see you, Anthony, but you and I have met several times at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab meetings, and I've always enjoyed your contributions. And my question is, here in Canada, we have 3 chaplains in universities. We're just getting started. And I was wondering, how did you build that non-religious community at the university? And was it well established before you got there in terms of some kind of a humanist title, or was it an extension of the Secular Student Alliance?
Thank you, Dr. Marty, for that question. It's great to see you again. I know that we see each other often in the virtual world. Yeah, I cannot take the full credit. I will say that the Humanist Chaplaincy actually was the labor of especially alumni and students actually through a period of more than 6 years, that they continue to labor and work towards the creation of a humanist chaplaincy. And it got actually founded in, if I'm not mistaken, in 2014. Again, as a humanist chaplaincy, they hired Walker Bristol as their first humanist in residence, was the actual title at the time. And then it went incrementally until then it became the humanist chaplain. Sorry, they became the humanist chaplain. And then the community transitioned from being called the Free Thought Society to then being called HCAT, as we affectionately call it, the humanist community at Tufts.
Thank you. Thanks, Marty. So Anthony, can you tell us a bit more about your leadership program for first generation spiritual leaders that you mentioned in your bio? I was curious.
Sure. No problem. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I mean, this mentorship program, this fellowship and mentorship program actually is through the collaboration with Interfaith America. I last December concluded actually a 9-month fellowship that's called the Interfaith Innovation Fellowship through Interfaith America. And it was through that process and that journey that I began to ponder and explore the possibilities of what does it look like to create a program where students from historically marginalized and historically not represented traditions can actually come to the Interfaith Center, right? Of course, I was open to anywhere on campus, and explore, right, dimensions of ethics, of cultural expressions, of just exploring their daily life experience, while being supported by someone of that same positionality, getting a small stipend, having food on every meeting, and again, feeling empowered that the Interfaith Center was a space for them to be able to utilize as they saw fit and important for them. And so basically, we did a whole semester of exploring multiple themes, topics, and explorations. And of course, because it was under this notion of freedom making, right? Though, of course, I had a whole outline and I had, this whole program, I also led the students to co-design and co-create with me. And so that meant that the space was open to really exploring questions, quandaries, and curiosities that they were bringing every time that we met. And we did meet, actually next week is our last meeting, on a biweekly model.
And we have a related question in the chat, in the Q&A. To what extent does your role support students in advocating for themselves on campus? Do you refer to other places? Do you liaise with human resources or other student services?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, we're one of very few, if not three, I believe, confidential resources in the university, which means that anything that any student, staff, or faculty shares in this space does not get reported beyond the walls of this office. And so I would say that students really feel empowered to come and share their grievances, right? Their trauma, their difficulties, either academically, emotionally, spiritually, or ethically, right? And of course, we're basically just listening. But again, because we are also in the context of higher ed, there is a bit of educating, and there is a way of directing and guiding them initially to their own resources, right? For them to realize that they are hopefully part of a broader ecosystem within the university and beyond that's there to empower them to really embody and practice agency and be able to say, hey, this is what's happening in my life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for illuminating, clarifying, right? Whatever it is that they're bringing. And then in collaboration with other departments and other colleagues, definitely we do support in that advocating. I mean, the chaplaincy in itself, regardless of our own positionality, right? May you be the Protestant, Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist, Humanist, or Muslim chaplain, we're student facing. And so a lot of our work is really allowing the students to own their own voice and really feel that they have the power to really make those changes and determination.
Now it can, anyway. I just want to make a couple of recommendations, if I may. There's a good book that you might find of interest called The Transcendent Brain, Spirituality in the Age of Science by Alan Lightman, who's a physicist. It's recently published. You might want to take a look at that. That might be of interest to you. Pardon my ignorance, but I'm currently reading a book entitled Muslim Women in Contemporary North America. And it introduced me to the concept, though I don't fully understand, living the dialogical and negotiating identity and meaning in that sense. And do you use the dialogical method in your work?
I mean, I would say that I do, or at least at best, I really try to always utilize it. I think that one of the methods that I employ in my humanist chaplaincy is always being aware of this power dynamic, being name or unname of, you are part of the central administration of the university, you are staff, you have all these degrees that might be after your name. And even though they may not be named or thrown, right, constantly, people do look you up. They do read your bio, of course. They go to the website. And so sometimes there is this, not necessarily fear, but apprehension, right, of coming to the university chaplaincy and just, again, engaging with us. However, I think that once they do meet us, they do find that this is a very warm space where it's basically for them, right? And so I would say that, yes, dialogue is key, especially, of course, since at a bare minimum, most of us have a 1 unit of clinical psychospiritual education, right? Definitely this notion of the action, reflection, new action, right, is always, I think, ingrained in our brain. And so we're always doing, in some shape or form, that kind of practice.
Okay. I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
To what extent did Martin Buber's I-thou, ignoring the eternal thou, but I-thou relationship type of looking at people is used today in the humanist chaplaincy area?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not that kind of philosopher, so I've never been able to really fully in-depth grasp some of the philosophy that he's stating with the I and thou,
Okay.
right? So I wouldn't have a solid answer for that.
Okay. I have one other question. Personally, I don't particularly care for the word spirituality, though I understand why it's being used. But if I came to you and I said, I don't like the word spirituality because for me it implies that there's duality. There's something beyond the material, something supernatural. What terminology would you use other than the word spirituality to communicate to me?
Yeah, I mean, I would turn it back and say, what words, what concepts, what idea, what vocabulary are you comfortable utilizing? And then I would take it from there.
I would come back to that and say, I'm looking at you as a source of different ideas.
Okay. So then in that case, I would say, you know, some of the words that I utilize is naturalistic inquiry. The understanding that the human being, that the human person, the human species is part of and is with the unfolding of nature. And so I would say, you know, for me, that's one of the frameworks that I utilize. I would also just invite you, and of course, this is more extemporaneous, right? But if we were to meet and I had time, I would say, hey, I'm going to refer you to different scholars, practitioners, and textbooks that really help us also expand the frameworks and notions of what spirituality is.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Great. I apologize if this question was asked earlier. I joined a bit late. I spent 12 years as a campus minister, as a campus lay minister for an organization similar to Campus Crusade for Christ or InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So I've been on many campuses across Canada and the United States, and the evangelical movement on these campuses is quite strong, quite organized, and quite successful in my view. Now, I've completely deconverted, and I'm a humanist. Is there any sort of, maybe this is the wrong term, but outreach and promotion of humanist values? Is it more just passive intake, or is there an actual active outreach on campus to, I guess, make converts, if I can put it that way, to the humanist or atheist philosophy?
Yeah, I would say that we try to model, or let me rephrase, I try to model a humanist praxis that's always in conversation, in relationship, and embodiment across the university. Of course, I'm one person. And of course, my students do an amazing job, right, with their own programming and just sustaining the community. And so I would say that people do know that the Humanist Chaplaincy exists on campus, especially with a lot of the work that I do, even beyond just the chaplaincy per se, specifically through some of the opportunities that I've gotten to teach and instruct at the university, especially this coming fall, where I'm going to be teaching a course on humanism for the everyday life. And so I have been getting a growing number of emails inquiring about the syllabus and the course. That being said, of course, there is this ethical practice, right, of not proselytizing, and that goes in multiple directions. So there is not necessarily a fiery work of wanting to convert people, no pun intended, right, to humanism or non-theism or free thought. It's more of framing and positioning humanism as an alternative way of life that they can actually are free to explore.
And I have one more question, please, if I may.
Sure.
If someone was wanting to become a humanist chaplain, what's the best path of education to achieve that, to achieve the recognition where you'd almost be undeniable given your qualifications and experience?
Yeah, oh, that's such a complex question. And of course, I'm going to be speaking from my own personal experience. I think that you can always be debated and be found as not being humanist chaplain enough, right? Because a lot of times we do have a very specific framework or understanding or vision of what a humanist chaplain is, right? But if we are looking at it more from an organizational standpoint or framework, definitely completing your undergrad degree, though of course there's exceptions. And then the high recommendation of completing a master's degree that somewhat aligns between pastoral spiritual care, theology, religious studies, completing a 1 unit at a minimum of clinical psychospiritual education, internships, all of that, and then going to your respective organization wherever you are located, right? May that be the Humanists of Canada, may that be the Humanist Society, which is the equivalent here, especially to get credentialed or endorsed as a Humanist Chaplain or Celebrant. And then, of course, finding a job. I would say that's like the epitome of being validated, in my opinion. But of course, if you have the credential, then you are that which the credential is allowing you to operate under.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Anthony, if I may follow up on that last question, how hard is it to get a chaplaincy role at a university? Say, like, are those unicorn jobs, quote unquote? How do you look for them if someone is interested in following that path?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in the framework of Tufts, it is a unicorn, right? So as far as I know, and if it's not true, please send me an email and I would love to stand corrected. But all the chaplains here at Tufts University are staff. They're paid by the university. We're not paid by outside organizations and or individual fundraising for a salary. And so under that model, I would say that it's very unique. Other models that other universities have, like Harvard and other institutions where they have a group of more than 40 chaplains, right? They are basically from outside, right? They're being funded, they're doing fundraising, they're being supported out of their own organizations, as far as I know. And so I would say that, yes, you can be X, Y, and Z chaplain. However, I think the dynamic of, are you fully integrated into the life of the university, or are you in this framework, right, of inside, outside? Yeah, so I would say it's pretty unique in my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Michael, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Here in Brantford, where I live, the university as an institution, if I put on my Catholic hat, they're sort of guilty of corporate sin. So a large number of, about 3,000 local people have been displaced by the gentrification by Wilfrid Laurier University moving here. And Wilfrid Laurier knew that from the beginning, and the response of the city is to hire more police to keep people moving until eventually, hopefully, they'll go away and die somewhere out of sight. And I've interviewed the local people, property owners, and that's their opinion about people who are homeless. I'm not aiming this at you, okay, specifically, or at Tufts University, but what I see is that in several different cases, in different locations, Tufts University is reported to be gentrifying the communities that they're in. So I'm not asking you to take accountability for that. What I'm asking is, within your role as a chaplain, to what extent do you have the freedom to advise the administration about the ethics of what they're doing? I was a whistleblower. I lost my job by advising my own employer about the ethics of how we interacted with the community. So there's a risk to it. So I'm asking you from the point of view of a chaplaincy.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that I, in all transparency, have not gotten the opportunity to engage in that conversation with the powers that be within the hierarchy of the university. However, I do know that historically, the university chaplaincy has had a very good and strong and healthy relationship with the university. And so I do know that we are always providing that care and accompaniment through the whole structure of the university. And so that wisdom, that advice, and that care, I have seen it being implemented throughout the whole university.
Do you get to interact with the public?
Yeah, at least, yes. I would say that so each chaplain, of course, has their own chaplaincy. And so in a way, right, are they just providing programming specific to their community and or doing more community facing work? It depends on a case by case. But at least in the Humanist Chaplaincy, all our events are open to the neighborhood and to the communities nearby.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We have two more questions in the Q&A. What are some specific challenges related to humanist chaplaincy in post-secondary education? I say this because traditional chaplaincy is associated with organized religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the challenges in higher education would be, in my opinion, of course, the lack of cohesion across the multiple secular non-theist organizations to support humanist chaplaincy in higher ed, right? There is this recognition that, of course, we exist and we're doing really good work, as Michael, you mentioned, right? Like doing the works of ethics, engaging in civic discourses. In some instances, like I had the opportunity this fall of instructing a one credit course around civic engagement and interfaith life. And so, right, engaging that dimension of the social, political, and the ethical, not just from the context of being a student, but going outside the university and exploring through conversations with people at the governor's office, right, and engaging in those conversations of what does ethics look like? What does engaging in social critical analysis look like, right? And so I would say that in that sense, that has been something that's very meaningful, positive, and transformative. However, that does not erase the fact that I think there is still, I would say, apprehension or maybe a sense of maybe ignorance even of what is humanist chaplaincy. And more specifically, what is humanist chaplaincy in higher ed from members of our own community, right? And sometimes saying, well, we are more focused on our specific work and are not so interested in supporting or nurturing or sustaining a humanist chaplaincy. And of course, I'm not just referring to financial contributions, I just mean very broadly, right, of support and relationship and collaboration. And so at least from that sense, there is still that work that needs to be had. Yes.
And have you received any resistance?
Yeah.
Humanist chaplain?
I don't think that I've received any resistance, actually. Not yet, I would say.
Okay, next question. I'd love to know what kinds of ethical concerns are brought forward to you as university chaplain, and how do you walk through those particular types of queries in your role?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of ethics, I mean, some of the students are exploring their own relationship with, I want to study X, Y, and Z major. And this is what's really drawing me, right? Making me become more alive and what's really in line with my own core values, right? And the way that I want to make meaning in the world. However, my parents are the one paying tuition. And so I'm at this crossroads, right? I can't change, but this is what I'm dealing with, right? And I continue to explore, and I find that this is really deeply transformative for me, right? And so allowing the students to begin to feel comfortable with speaking with their parents, and of course, safety is key, right, in the chaplaincy. So we never advise a student, just use their voice, just tell them what you need and be done. I think that there is more of this cultivating and nurturing, right, relationship with family members, especially again when there is an imbalance of power. That said, depending on the finances, right, and support of your immediate family or chosen family in that regard. And so I think that that's what's very complex in terms of ethics. Another ethical conundrum, I would say, is that some of the students, again, I think we're a pretty diverse university in the sense that we do even have students that are international or coming from beyond the West, right? And a lot of times students are coming in for the first time to the US potentially and really being exposed, right, to the plethora of possibilities, right? Not just in terms of academic, but also in terms of student life in general. And that extends, of course, to religious, ethical, and cultural life on campus, which the university chaplaincy is part of that, right? And so they do get exposed to this notion of like, wow, like there are all these traditions, right, that are here for me, again, in a non-judgmental way, and are allowing me to explore all these ethics, all these philosophies and spiritualities, and they're here to accompany me through this process. Even though that's beautiful and that's powerful and that provides freedom, that does not diminish the fact that some of the students are really having internal struggles and saying, hey, you know, like I grew up in this particular tradition in this part of the world. And so the Bible is my foundation. And as I'm unfolding in this journey, I'm finding X, Y, and Z, right, is not true, or I'm struggling with my own sexuality and gender or cultural expressions, being in the diaspora, right? And so it's not just one dimensional, it's very eclectic in the sense of how students are really exploring ethics.
Thank you. Marty, please unmute yourself.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm just going to respond because my involvement here in Canada with Humanist Chaplaincy is pretty historical, and there have been a couple of questions about kind of our Humanist Chaplaincy here in Canada by Lewis and a few others. And I think it's important to know that probably the strongest organization that we have found on campus that represents humanistic values is the Secular Student Alliance. And it's a group that I started at the university that I'm at, although it's kind of hard to hold it together because the students graduate. And but that has been a reasonably good response to some of the conservative religious groups on campus made available. I don't know if you still have that at Tufts. The other thing is that Humanist Chaplaincy here in Canada on universities is not paid like it is at Tufts. We're all volunteers and we all have other work. So it has to be some kind of a career kind of balancing act for us here. And I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that our international students that I have consulted with in universities see our pluralism, and they also, it's a time in their lives when they're really exploring and they're far away from their parents. And I would say I'm interested in how you have handled probably the most controversial conversations I've had in the university I work at is with young people who are leaving their faith, and they sought me out after hearing lectures on humanism and wanted to know how to become involved and how to handle their parents' pushback on their leaving the faith. It's a very delicate issue, particularly among the Islamic students who can be very shunned by their family, and even the family shunned at the local mosque if they are known to have a child who's an apostate. How have you handled that at Tufts? Have you had any of those kinds of international students that have kind of tried to deal with their own changes of faith while at university and the risks that they face?
Yeah, thank you, Marty, for that question. I'm hearing maybe 2 or 3 different components to the question. In terms of the Secular Student Alliance, currently HCAT is not affiliated with any outside organization. And that, of course, is part of the practice of the university of keeping boundaries between the influence of outside organizations and student life on campus. And so there isn't that direct relationship. However, individually, a lot of the chaplains are in relationship with national and international organizations, as you read in my bio. And so this summer, I am actually going to be presenting at the Secular Student Alliance, especially talking around convivial relations within pluralistic worlds. So it's going to be my first time presenting at SSA and being exposed right to this national basically organization that's providing care accompaniment, right, and support to secular students across North America and potentially beyond. In terms of the care to what I maybe would call doubly marginalized communities, I haven't had students that identify within the Islamic tradition that have come to thought up my care accompaniment, especially in terms of belief and unbelief, and transitioning, right, or deconverting from specific traditions. I would say part of that, I think it's given that within the spectrum of students that have opted into being surveyed, more than 40% of at least the past 2 years of surveys, students identify within the spectrum of what I call non-theist, within the spectrum of humanism, I would say, right? But humanistic philosophies, let me clarify, right? So that could fall within like Unitarian Universalism, that of course is covering atheism, agnosticism, humanism, and then other traditions as well. And so there is a more, let's say, progressive vibe that's known or associated with Tufts University in that sense.
You're very
I think it's
fortunate
different.
that your university did that kind of survey. Our university's never done that, although I have encouraged them to do that. But we have done those surveys in the greater Vancouver area where I live, and we find even a higher percent. We found 69% of youth were unidentified as in a religious institution. So it's very high here, and it does give us a voice, although it's not always very recognized as a humanist chaplain, but at least the other chaplains do recognize it and do refer to me.
And in that response, I would say that more of an individual offering and support that I try to provide, recognizing, right, these positions of privilege, if I may say so, right, is providing this care and accompaniment, not just to students, but organizations and university across the US. Because as you're highlighting, I think that it is important to really ask ourselves as humanists, non-theists, free-thinkers, right, and secularists that serve in higher ed, right, are we just siloing ourselves to these positions and these places of power, or are we continuing to recognize that this is an ecosystem that has to continually be cared and nurtured and sustained, right? So that as other traditions were really able to establish an intergenerational pathway of sorts, where people, regardless of where they are in the US or Canada or internationally, that they feel connected. Because I think that part of the dimension of care, it's recognizing that students, staff, and even faculty, right, at times are in positions or states of vulnerability, right, as they're teaching, as they're exploring philosophies, as they're engaging with other human beings and non-sentient beings in the biosphere, right? Our ethics, our understanding, our worldviews, our practices change drastically. And so how are we providing those spaces of care?
It's a good point that people's spirituality and meaning and worldviews do evolve, and they seem to change fairly quickly sometimes in universities. So having a very pluralistic view of it, interfaith view of it as a philosophy is very important. I agree with that.
Thank you both. Next question: are there any universities in North America that are that champion humanist studies and other degrees?
Yes. I would say I don't have, of course, the most updated information on that data or that information, but I would say at the top of my head, Pitzer University has the only undergraduate degree in secular studies, right? Spearheaded and championed, if we will, by Dr. Phil Zuckerberg, who's a sociologist.
Okay, thank you. So,
Sorry,
Go ahead.
and I would also add at least United Theological Seminary in Minneapolis, right, that recently last year launched their Masters of Divinity and or Masters of Leadership Studies with a concentration in humanism, right, and that's co-sponsored with the American Humanist Center for Education. And so you maybe potentially have this pathway, right, of potentially doing an undergrad degree with that focus, of course, if that's your desire, and then potentially exploring graduate work. And of course, we're talking about humanism. You can definitely choose any other fields, right? Anthropology, sociology, or even religious studies, right? In a more academic lens and discipline, and then go that route as well.
Okay, thank you. So Anthony, from your perspective, what is the difference between secular helping professions such as psychotherapy and humanist chaplaincy?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that between the main difference of being licensed by the state, right, which I think is a huge distinction that, of course, has to be named. I think both fields are really looking at the inquiry of various frameworks. I would say the inner and outer world, that's really the meaning-making system of humans, right, that are eliciting meaning-making processes of life. And I would say that are not necessarily focused on the framework of diagnosing and pathologizing, right, the human, the experiences, the stories that students, staff, or faculty are bringing. And so, at least in my experience, I would say, we are really looking at it, as Anton T. Voisin mentioned, right, who's known as the founder of TPE of sorts, right, is this humans as living documents. And so for me, it's more this framework of looking at the stories and the experiences that humans are having and eliciting from them meaning, right, purpose and significance, not imposing them, but guiding the person, right, to explore them in that way.
And in your role as chaplain, do you work with social workers, counselors? Do your paths cross? What does that
Yes,
mean?
I would say that our university chaplaincy is amazing in that way, right? Again, we have a very strong and central relationship with the whole university, and so we're always constantly interfacing and collaborating with the clinical and mental health care services. We're collaborating with the admissions department, with social workers, with on-campus police, with RAs, so residential life, as well as, of course, the academic counseling department, right, which here is the Student Accessibility and Academic Resource Center, with which I'm actually having an event next Wednesday titled Living a Meaningful Life, Academics and What Matters to You, right, kind of flipping maybe the discourse that we have been talking about of challenging in this age of neoliberal hustle, right, this constant demand for credentialing, right, and really looking at how can we make a more meaningful and sustainable life.
Thank you. Michael, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi. So with the title Revitalizing Care, Anthony, I've, as a counselor, I counseled nurses who told me that nurses that they worked with no longer thought of human beings as human beings, but in abstract terms. They thought of them as statistics or as Canada's public services are preparing for being privatized and being sold to American corporations. The way that human beings are treated is changing. So they wonder about where the care is gone. In my own job, what happened was we evolved from calling people citizens to calling them clients to calling them customers, and then eventually the units of business. And then a success for us wasn't really a success for the patient. Okay, for the nurses, people were sent home after surgery without getting without spending enough time to recover in hospital. So it wasn't really a success, but it was a success for the system as an industry.
Right.
And here and as an employment counselor, people were they were told that was all the service they're going to get. They were a success, even though we didn't really treat them as human beings. The system evolved. And then even when I went for counseling myself, when my son died here in Canada, I waited 2 years, I got one meeting, and they called it a success. My sister is a forensic counselor, and she's encountered the same thing. There's no longer any time in the system for actually working with people and treating them as human beings. When I'm listening to you, I hear that you relate to the people in front of you as flesh and blood human beings with a history, with a life, with feelings, etc. How do you work? How does your system work? Does it allow you to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I'm trying not to smile because I think that this is one thing that I can say that I speak for the university. The rest of it, I think, is personal reflection. The university chaplain, at least in my experience for the past 2 years, has been that we're student facing, period. And what that means is if one student shows up, it's a success. If 5, 10, 20, or if it's a more bigger event, it's amazing. And so for me, I think in that way, we're really practicing this anti-capitalist, right? This anti-racist framework that, of course, that has been adopted by the whole university as a benchmark, right, for the upcoming years. And so I would say that, at least in my experience, in my specific chaplaincy, I would say that, yeah, we're just really here. We exist and we're present and we're available to the students, no question asked, no metrics. I mean, of course, we develop surveys and right, all this way of collecting data just for our inner work and growth and development. But I would say that we do have the freedom to really employ and practice and embody care in very transgressive and positive ways.
That's appreciated.
And Craig, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have another question. The young people that you're dealing with, I would consider probably, if not, they're the digital natives, because they basically grew up after the iPhone, which I think came out in 2008. And so I'm curious, are you noticing any difference with these young people, 22 and younger, as opposed to 10 students that came by 10 years ago? Are we seeing a change of human beings now because of all the digital world that they've been growing up in?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer, actually. I think definitely, I mean, the digital world, there is a process of hybridization, I would say, right, between what we have known historically or normally as the real world, and then the world of technology, of the digital, of the iPhone, as you're saying, right, in that sense of media. And I think that those of us that are a little bit younger, of course, I'll own it, with a huge learning curve, I would say are always trying to implement a more hybrid experience. For example, I moderated an event yesterday, right, through the American Humanist Association and the Humanist International Association around this Ethics Delight, a forum around social and structural violence, right? And so that was a collaboration across all these organizations and the Humanist Chaplaincy, and it was fully virtual, right? And then the upcoming events that are happening in the summer are hybrid, and then again in the fall, we're doing it fully virtual. And so I think that at least from my end, there is always this learning and relearning of how do we engage with those different intergenerational learnings.
I have another question, if I may.
Sure.
Responsibility is very important, and I think from an atheist humanist standpoint, the responsibility lies with the individual and human beings in general, as when you compare it to faith-based worldviews who have some sort of conception of God, where that's where the final responsibility lies. Do you think that people who are coming from a faith base and they're discussing about humanism fully appreciate that that concept of responsibility has changed significantly as they live their lives? That it's really their responsibility, it's not God's responsibility?
I mean, I think that kind of tags into the notion of a secularizing world. So I think in my very limited experience, I think it's layered, right? I think that a lot of traditions, even theist traditions, their members, the people, I think are operating from a more secular mode of being. Well, of course, their congregational experience might be more spiritual or theistic in that sense. And I think that within the non-theist, humanist, and secularist framework, especially the younger generations, I think have a more fluid understanding of that experience. I think that has to do maybe with the difference in terms of religious spiritual trauma that maybe they're not experiencing as maybe other generations. And so I think that there might be a difference in that. However, because at least in being a chaplain in higher ed, there is the implementation and usage of more evidence-based, right, and academic inquiry and critical thinking that is already like organically being employed by students, especially in the humanist community. I think we're more of this STEM, social science, anthropology kind of bend, at least in the past 2 years. And so there is this more sociopolitical, ethical analysis that's being utilized in the space.
Thank you, Anthony and Craig. And looks like we have time for one more question. What does ethics of care mean, and what literature would you recommend to explore this further?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm kind of sad that we did not get to that part of the presentation. But I would say that one of the scholars that has been really nurturing and providing a framework for me has been Fisher and Dr. Tronto, right, who talk about an ethic of care and who state that specifically this notion around care is everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we live in it as well as possible, right? And I'm quoting, of course, that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. I think has been one of the initial frameworks that I've been utilizing, especially Dr. Tronto's understanding around caring about, care for, care of, and then the practices that need to be employed in ways, to maintain and concretize work that involves the caring, giving and the caring receiving, right? And this for me has been very paramount in my work because I find that, yes, as some of you have mentioned through your questions, there might be this flow, this move, or this deconstruction process of moving in the spectrum of belief, unbelief, spirituality, and religion. However, at times there isn't the structures and the care and the accompaniment to make sure that that whole person, right, is being cared for, no pun intended, right? And so for me, through my own chaplaincy, right, I see care, and again, being influenced by scholars like Bella Casa, understanding that care is a human trouble. Though it is not just only for the human, right? But this does not make care a human only matter, if I may quote it correctly. And so I find that this notion of species work or activity within the ethical, social, political, and cultural implications, at least in my humanist chaplaincy, is something that I continually try to develop and model and employ in my chaplaincy. Because I think that given everything that we have been going through, the multiple chaos, global separation, right, and distancing, and all of these notions of trauma and abuse and violence that we're experiencing globally in the theist world, as well as intra-communally between the non-theist, secularist, and humanist communities, I think care is something that we urgently and critically need.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anthony, for sharing your journey and your thoughts with us this evening. Thank you all for attending. Please stay tuned for further announcements about our upcoming webinars and events. All this information is posted on our website. You can also follow us on social media channels. And also, I'd like to invite you to please, if you have a moment, to complete our post-webinar survey, where you can suggest a speaker or a topic, and we always appreciate your feedback. You will find the link in the follow-up email from Zoom. And on that note, Anthony, once again, thanks for being here, for being available, and for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation, and I look forward to further collaboration.
And I know some of you will continue this conversation beyond the calls. Looking forward to that as well. Thank you. Good evening.
You're welcome.